White Knight Chronicles. This is a video game I've been talking about for a very long time. I'm sorry if you're like, Ben, you talk about White Knight Chronicles way too much. I'm here. I finally did it. I did the deed. I finished it. Why care about White Knight Chronicles in the age of 2025? Look, buddy. This is like one of those games that I would say is like a system-defining game for me. When I say that, it's more of like an identity thing. What was the identity of this platform? And that often doesn't have to necessarily do with like the best games that came out on the system. A lot of times for me, it's like, what were the games that kind of presented a certain promise for a system, right? And White Knight Chronicles is one of those games that got announced in that like first wave of games, not immediately, but I think it was like within that year or two of the system before it came out, where they're like, check out this thing. This is the next gen of JRPGs. And if you go back and look at that trailer, it's definitely not real gameplay. But I kind of respect it because I think a lot of the ideas did make it into the final game, just the presentation wasn't quite 100% there. I think they generally did a good job of trying to meet that presentation overall, though. But yeah, it very much was like one of those games that got announced early on, kind of became a part of the PS3 system identity for me. And then I don't think it came out for at least a few years in the US, which, you know, about right back then for JRPGs. Took them a while to come over here most of the time. And I just never got around to it. And I finally picked up a copy a couple years ago, and I was like, I'm going to do it. And then I sat on that copy for a couple years, and here I am today. I did it. I will say I picked up the original White Knight Chronicles. Now, why is that important? Look, I kind of was just curious because White Knight Chronicles 2 includes a reworked version of White Knight Chronicles 1. And with how I am with video games, I think it's just kind of neat to see like how games get made, whether the quality is like good or not. And so I was really curious like what that original version of White Knight Chronicles looks like. So that's what I picked up today. If you want a better version of White Knight Chronicles, go look at a White Knight Chronicles 2 review of White Knight Chronicles 1. We're talking about the baseline White Knight Chronicles 1 here. But yeah, I think the big thing that I was really hearing about White Knight Chronicles 1 is just like the combat was very slow. And that is something that I, in some cases, really appreciate in games. I really appreciate games that take their time with combat and give you a lot of opportunity to kind of like read what's happening and react to what's happening and things like that. But in the case of this game, it's maybe even a little slow for me at times, but I kind of figured out over the course of the game like how to kind of speed it up a little bit. But yeah, you know, basically it's kind of like, I think I would maybe structure it a little bit more like a Phantasy Star style game in some ways. It is not really like this big open world kind of RPG. There's like a map you kind of go to, and you can like navigate that map to select different areas. And basically there's these towns, and then between those towns there's like dungeons. These dungeons, sometimes they're like overworld where you're like exploring to get to the next town kind of thing, but they are very maze-like. They're very narrow, so like don't expect like a big open world. Are there big fields? Sometimes, but like most of the time it is just fairly narrow. It's a very guided experience overall, which is something that I personally appreciate. I kind of appreciate it being like this world feels big, but there's like very narrow paths directing me where I go kind of thing. And I kind of like that in this case. And so you kind of walk around, and there's like the enemies are on the field and stuff like that. And then you can engage in a fight. When you engage in a fight in original White Knight Chronicles 1, you very quickly see how slow this game is because basically you have to engage the enemy, and then it fills up like an active time battle meter, if you're familiar with that term for like Final Fantasy, which basically is like, hey, when can you take an action? When the meter fills up, you can take an action. It's pretty slow, like 4 to 5 seconds slow. It's very slow. And then when you use an action, it is more than just like waiting for that meter to fill up, because the characters animate very slowly as well. So like if you're using a big axe, you'll like lunge back, lunge forward, and then recover where you're like pulling the axe up at a rate that like a normal human probably would. And then the active time bar meter that lets you go again doesn't actually start filling back up again until your character has returned back to its full idle stance. So it's this very slow combat system, which I say if you are not prepared for that, you'll probably have a lot of trouble with, because even I really struggled with this. But it's an interesting game because it does a lot of like weird things with its combat system in particular. The big kind of gimmick I would say this game is this system that's kind of like a combo system. So essentially, before fights, you can basically go and select a variety of moves from your character's skill set, which we'll get into skills here in a little bit, I'm sure. And then you can kind of like build out your own custom combo. So you can basically say, I want to have this move start the combo, and then I can have this move do the next part of the combo, so on and so on and so on. And these moves have different properties. Some of these I'm not 100% sure of. Like, I think there's some that have like crush versus slashing versus whatever. I never really noticed like how that would change how an enemy would react to damage or anything like that. Maybe it has something to do with their balance, which we'll get into. But it is very much something where you basically build up a combo, and then or you build out your combo, and then there's like a launch system where you can launch enemies in the air and then do hits in the air and then knock them back down kind of thing. So it's a kind of a 6 or 7 hit combo basically kind of thing. So you build out these moves, and they kind of like, you don't start with the full set of combos. You can do up to like 3 or 4 early on depending on how you level up your character. There's a lot of flexibility in how you level your character. So a lot of this game is about timing. And because the game moves so slow, it's like hard to know what that timing is, because essentially what you'll do is you'll want to try to like knock down the enemy and like throw them off balance. Well, this is typically for bosses. So you like try to knock them off balance, and then so what you try to do is line up your buffs, and you also have debuffs. So like I was using a berserker, so I could buff my attack and then, or my whole party's attack, and then reduce the enemy's like defense. But within that time frame, if they were knocked off balance, if I try to buff at that point, it's not really possible to like go and hit their weak point at that point. So I have to like kind of feel out when the boss is going to fall over. There's no meter as far as I can tell. You just got to kind of know based off like how much you've hit them, and you build up, you like kind of guess, you buff up, and then you go and try to hit their weak point with your biggest combo kind of thing. And that's kind of, I think, like, it's kind of the core satisfaction of the combat system in this game. It's like timing everything just right when you don't have a lot of information on exactly how a boss is gonna, like, when a boss will tumble down and how much time you have to hit them. And every boss has like different down periods of time, so some of them you have to really time, because it's like you don't even have a full action to take use of their weakness. You just have to kind of be ready to jump in and hit on that kind of thing. So it's a really fascinating like loop that I think when you hit it is like super satisfying, but it's a very slow process. And a part of what makes this also kind of slow is that these combos are not something that you have access to all the time. So you have a system called like the AC system. I think it's like action credits or something like that. I don't remember what it's presented as, but it's AC. And they're like these little blue dots that basically determine like how many special skills you can use. So your baseline attacks that are just like the one hits kind of thing, those are cost no action credits or whatever you want to call them. No action points. Let's call them action points even though it's AC. And so those don't cost anything, but the recovery rate of this AC is very slow. So typically for like a simple 3-hit combo, you're probably going to be spending around 3 AC points, AP points. Action points. But then for like a full combo, you're probably looking at like, I don't know, 9 to 10. So that's like a full like 7-hit combo or however long it is kind of thing. It depends on what you put in there and all that stuff, because every move has its own AC value. But you only recover an AC point, I think every like 4 to 5 actions. So as you can imagine, that's like every 30 seconds or so, I think you get 1 AC. So if that, I feel like it's even slower than that, honestly. So you have to like spend a lot of time kind of like building up to having these points ready. So this is part of the timing element as well. A lot of this game's about, again, timing it and just getting that just right moment where you kind of like execute kind of thing. So this is where like the game is not very clear about this. If you go watch that original trailer I mentioned earlier, you can kind of see some of this happening. So I think it was supposed to be something that you do. But you can switch between characters. It's not very convenient. You have to like press select, click the change character option, and then go and move to another character. But your AI characters, often they'll hoard their AC. So what usually ends up happening is that like you'll want to utilize your own character or the main character you're controlling to kind of like set up the best situation where you're like, okay, I think we're going to topple this guy. I'm going to buff my party and then debuff the boss, and then kind of like maybe do a short combo to kind of like try to like knock him down, and then I'll switch to one of the computers who also got buffed by my buff, and then, or one of the computer controlled characters, and then I'll use their like full on combo because they've been saving up that AC. I'm using that AC for myself to like manage the situation on my main character, but these other characters, they're saving up. So then you kind of like switch over to those characters, then you use their kind of skills to do that. So I think the earlier you start switching characters, I think in combat, the better. I went probably half the game not doing that. I think it was probably a mistake. I think you really should. But once you start doing that, I think the game starts to feel a lot faster because you do have like access to a lot of different resources versus like when you just play one character, you'll burn out your resources and then you have to kind of just like sit there and slowly poke at enemies until you build up enough resources to attack again. Which again, as somebody who likes slow games, I am not opposed to, and if anything, I like it in this game. I kind of like the attention to detail. I like that you can kind of like sit there and like watch the whole fight play out in a way, and you can kind of like see everybody animate. Like all the animations are like super detailed, and I feel like everything has like a lot of weight to it. Like it all feels justified being this slow to me. But I also recognize that like not everyone's gonna like that. And it is, I think, when you just play on your own, like even compared to something like, I'm a Final Fantasy XI guy, a game that is kind of also somewhat slow, depending on how you look at it, honestly. This game just feels like even substantially slower than that. So, but I think if you can get over that, if you are somebody who can maybe not get over that, if you're somebody who can appreciate that, because I do feel like I appreciated that. I like the gameplay of Knight Chronicles. I will say that much. Like, this is not something that I'm, like, forcing myself to like, but I think you gotta be coming in with the right mindset of, like, this is not gonna be a Devil May Cry Final Fantasy 16, something like that, right? This is not that. This is a very slow, methodical game where you're lining up a lot of pieces. Fans of Steel Diver for the Nintendo 3DS will love Knight Chronicles. Just watching everything. I love Steel Diver. Oh, man. Anyways, I just like, there's something about slow video games that like the impact, the feeling of everything just lining up just right. Steel Diver Sub Wars, the like first person shooter sub shooting game where you're just like slowly tracking someone down and you eventually get up on them. You're like, finally, I'm going to launch this missile. It's going to be 5 seconds till that missile hits them, but I love it. That kind of feeling is what Knight Chronicles gives. I know everyone can use Steel Diver as a context here. Especially PS3 fans love the 3DS game Steel Diver. Anyways, I'm shutting up in that regard, but I just wanted to convey, I think the combat's very cool despite how slow it is. And if you want a faster combat system, sounds like Knight Chronicles 2 does that. And maybe I'll play Knight Chronicles 2 at some point and be like, yeah, it's just better. Don't do Knight Chronicles 1. But I liked it at the very least. So, but I think it's also like has some interesting designs outside of the combat as well. Like there's like a lot of the dungeons are very maze-like, and it's a lot of kind of like exploration. And you know, again, it's not like you're exploring anything super crazy. It's pretty much just like walking down different paths and things like that. But there's a lot of things where you have to like kind of open your map, look at it, where am I going, and then there might be like in the sewer dungeon, you gotta like fall down certain sewer holes, go and like switch these levers and things like that. So while it is like generally kind of bland in how they look, usually it's a very like straightforward dungeon design in terms of aesthetic. You know, you're just in caves or something like that. There is like some little gimmick that kind of has you engage in it in a way that's not just walking forward all the time. There's a lot of different like little paths you can kind of go on, and those paths kind of loop around in different ways. And so even though it doesn't feel like a full open world, I think they do have a lot of interesting things if you go and explore. Or at least I'd say navigating the world itself feels pretty interesting to me in that regard. One thing I didn't even talk about is the skill system. Like leveling up this game, it's a very open game in terms of how you level up. So I think there are some restrictions, but most characters have access to most skills in the game. I think there's like, I think some of the cast can't use like 2 or 3 of the weapon types, but there's like, I think 9 or so of the weapon types. Maybe that includes magic, but basically you can kind of earn abilities while you're playing and, or while you get experience and things like that. And you can basically go and like unlock certain skills and certain like equipment paths. So like if you use sword and shield, there are moves and stuff you unlock using those points for sword and shield. So that might be like a shield bash, a stab, or like an uppercut, that kind of stuff. The actual moves of the like that go into your combo, those things don't overlap between the different like paths. So there are like basically skill trees that you go down for these particular weapons. However, there are additional like elements to these skill paths that are beneficial. So if you want to go as like, you know, a sword and shield character, but you want like the stat buffs of like a berserker class, you can go and like build into that skill tree, and instead of like building out the like on the movements of like what actual like moves you can use as a berserker with the berserkers have like a giant axe. I don't know if that's the right term for it. I'm calling it a berserker though. That's basically what it is. We have like a giant axe. You can't use any of the skills that like are involving your axe itself, but you can get like stat buffs and things like that. So you can get like vitality up, strength up, that kind of thing. For any kind of spell categories, those spells can also be equipped to your character as well. So you can go upgrade those different spell categories. If you're playing the game just kind of through the normal story mode, you'll probably get to like 100% of the skill tree if you upgrade one skill tree all the way through. In a single playthrough, and then you get to dabble a little bit in like these kind of side paths kind of thing. So, but you have freedom to kind of like switch around to different weapons. The weapons themselves, I think, I didn't really get like a great sense of like how different they all are. It definitely feels like the two-handed weapons that don't allow you to equip a shield and things like that did way more damage. I think my friend, I didn't go into this too much, but my friend mentioned to me that like the sword and shield's kind of like a single target tank kind of setup, where the spear is kind of like a multi-group tank setup where like that person can attack certain or attract the attention of groups of enemies and things like that. But I will be honest with you, I think a lot of this party dynamic stuff didn't really come off in playing White Knight Chronicles in the year of 2025, because the AI just isn't really particularly good at knowing what to do with these skills. You kind of just have a few different options for telling your AI what to do, which is kind of go all out, which is basically they'll use all their resources all the time. Kind of be conservative, so don't use a lot of your resources, just kind of go and, you know, slash things normally, or focus on healing or something like that. And so, but you know, if you're trying to get someone to do a tank roll, you can tell them go all out, but like what that means to them is kind of, you know, up in the air. I tried having the AI like tank enemies and things like that, and it never really worked, in my opinion. So I mostly focused on just kind of doing them as much damage as possible. And through most of the game, that was plenty to get through. Just like building up a pretty decent, like, you know, burn setup where everybody does enough damage to kind of burn down most of the bosses. Had a little bit of struggle towards the end of the game. But, you know, once I started using items, then it was like I blew through the rest of the game at that point, because items are pretty useful in this game in terms of just like once you get to the later part of the game, you do start like running out of MP. I feel like it depends again on how you build your character and stuff, but so I just kind of like mass purchased like MP healing moves and things like that. So generally it's there's a lot of systems in this game in terms of like being able to craft new weapons and upgrade and enhance weapons, and like I engage with that stuff a little bit, but at least in the scope of like playing the story mode, it doesn't really matter. So why I say in 2025 for that is because I think the thing I did not realize was just how geared towards multiplayer White Knight Chronicles is. There's a ton of missions in the game that I just could not really play because, as far as I can tell, there's no way to bring your like AI companions into it. So you just kind of have to go online and play. And so if you try to play them, you're going to be playing alone. And my character as a berserker class doesn't necessarily have the skill set to fight, you know, full groups of enemies alone. Like, these are fights that feel, or missions that feel balanced for like 4 characters. So unless I like really go out of my way to like over level for it, I'm usually just going to get destroyed basically. Thankfully, if you want to play like through the story mode of the game today, none of it really matters. And I believe one of the improvements in White Knight Chronicles 2, I could be wrong, this might be fan fiction, so just be aware of that, is you can basically bring in like additional NPCs and things like that into there. I don't know for sure on that. So there's a lot of this multiplayer stuff that, for my perspective, is just kind of not really something I'm going to engage with in this game. But again, I think White Knight Chronicles 2, a game that also doesn't have a server, so also not multiplayer, I believe at least accommodates single player a little bit better from what I've heard. How true that is, again, I don't really know. But yeah, I guess I just wasn't really expecting to see like how much this game was geared towards multiplayer. And in some ways, it feels like maybe it was a game that was not intended to be like that multiplayer at first. I think the reason I say that is because like narratively, you have a creative character in this game. This character is amazing in the sense of how much he does, or mine was a guy, how much they do not matter in the context of the story. You are literally like the main character's coworker who just so happens to be working the same day as him, and you get dragged off on this journey. I think at like one time a character kind of like side eyes you during a scene that makes me think they're trying to hint to like eventually your character will be something. But until then, until White Knight Chronicles 2, nothing happens with your character. So you have this created character that just feels very afterthought. You were just like in the background of all these cutscenes at like maybe 50% of the time, maybe not even that. So yeah, it just feels like they kind of like stapled on this created character to this story and then maybe like made a multiplayer game after the fact. But then they're like, I guess you can play your character in the story as well. So there's like a main cast. I will say story-wise, this game is just kind of like, I would say generally pretty flat. It's not bad, I will say. It's just kind of like, most of the game is kind of just like, oh, the princess got kidnapped. Go chase after her kind of thing. And that's pretty much most of the game. In the back half of the game, they start to get more into like, what is the story of what's going on? In a lot of ways, these story elements kind of relate more to like side characters. It was very like almost like Xenosaga kind of flashback where like all of a sudden Xenosaga 2 is about like a different set of characters mostly, and the main character gets kind of thrown to the back. This game like has two side characters that suddenly become incredibly important to the story, and that's just kind of where the story goes at that point. So it's not really like a complete narrative in that sense, but it does feel like a game that was like, in my opinion, it feels like a game that did not quite reach the finish line. I can't say for sure not having played White Knight Chronicles 2, but it feels like it just kind of ends on kind of a weird note of like nothing super resolved, but they give you like some little pieces here and there to kind of make it feel a little bit more resolved. So just don't come into this game expecting like too much, but if you don't mind like some just like kind of cardboard cutout kind of characters, for the most part, I think it's kind of fine. Just there's not a lot of personality to them, and there's nothing too crazy going on there. So, but I think in a lot of times in cases, as long as I enjoy the gameplay for a game, I can kind of overlook that without too much trouble. And I did like the back half of the story. I will say that much. I did enjoy what was there, even though it was kind of late and kind of like irrelevant to the first half of the game in some ways. Not irrelevant, but kind of the first half of the game just doesn't really have a lot going on. Maybe we should say it that way. Oh, there's one other thing as well I should probably touch. There's like mechs in this game too. I feel like these mechs feel more like showpieces than they are real gameplay. They don't really, as far as I can tell, have the combo system in the same way. So it's more about just kind of choosing different attack moves. But they're all different attack moves, and you just kind of like attack different parts of the limbs. But again, it's one of those things where, like, I don't think the game explains itself well enough to really make me feel like anything matters in those scenes. I did have one time where I almost died in it, but I did not. And I don't necessarily know why that happened or why I succeeded. So I kind of just took them as story set pieces kind of thing. And yeah, it's just kind of a weird thing. So most of the time, whenever possible, I would just fight normally. I think you can choose to like summon the mech whenever you want. I actually never did it, so I don't actually know. But yeah, it was a fascinating game to play. Because I just feel like there's not anything quite like that. In some ways, it kind of feels like a PSP game made with a PS3 budget, is maybe the way I'd put it. But like, I think that's cool in some ways. I do think like one thing that was like kind of therapeutic about playing White Knight Chronicles. There's kind of two sides of this. First and foremost, visually, I'm going to say this. I'm not someone who comments on visuals very much. It's just a nice looking game. Every time I go back to the PS3, I'm like, dang, these games look good. The character models obviously don't look like quite like a modern character model. I am at the point now where like so many games are like this cell shaded anime look. Anytime it's like a PS2 anime looking model just with higher polygon count, I'm kind of like, I'm glad I'm seeing this instead, because I feel like so many games just have the same like anime aesthetic now, and I'm just like, to not deny, this is how all like RPGs look back then as well. So this is not saying White Knight Chronicles is a uniquely special visual game. It's just kind of going back. It's kind of nice to have like a different aesthetic again for these kind of games, I feel like. But also, like, I think at the time I had a very negative view of the video game industry, like going into like, I think this game came out in 2009. And I think at the time I wrote an article about like how I was just like sick and tired of the HD generation. That's why I was sticking to the Wii, baby, because the Wii's where the innovation's at kind of thing, right? And part of this was like, if you go and watch my Nintendo video or whatever, this is like part of the messaging of Nintendo, right? Is like the game industry is stagnant kind of thing, right? But I will say this, like at a time that I felt like video games were like super stagnant and uninteresting and not evolving in any way, I can play White Knight Chronicles and be like, that was not true. I think that was just like a perspective I had, and I just kind of like forced that upon these systems at that time. And I think why that gives me a lot of like weird hope is because I think a lot of times when I talk to people about like the modern industry, it's always about like how video games will never be the same. Which, I mean, it's true. Video games will never be the same. But like, I think every generation of video games is like kind of exciting so far still. And I think there's like, I would look at the PS3 and 360 era and be like, man, video games probably feel pretty similar compared to the modern industry, especially like looking at the graphics. Like, look at these visuals. They're like almost, in my opinion, almost in line of modern games. I'm not a picky visual guy, so don't take that as a word of like a graphics person. I like, this game chugs at times and I'm like, yeah, frame rate down. But like, I'm not hurting because of that. I just kind of like seeing it because it's just like, oh boy, this frame rate. And then like the game moves so slow, it doesn't matter. But it was just kind of like a nice feeling of just like, yeah, sometimes you just like look at the industry and you feel like everything's bad, but when you look back at it, you're like, actually everything was fine. I mean, it has its problems, don't get me wrong. The era of the industry has its problems, but generally video games are still good today. And I feel like that was true of White Knight Chronicles. It is such a weird thing in hindsight, but at the time I probably would not have recognized that. So I appreciate that today, looking at it in the year 2025, that I can respect that. And I hope that means that when I look back on 2025 video games, I can also respect 2025 video games for what they're doing. Who knows? White Knight Chronicles 1. Do you play it? I don't know, but I had a good time. So I hope you enjoyed that. It's kind of a rambly thing, but I just kind of went with it. So take care. Play White Knight Chronicles, I guess. I'm not recommending this game to you. I'm just saying I enjoyed it.